Well, it looks like folks are coming in. I want to begin by welcoming you all here today. My name is Sheldon Figler, President of the Canadian Rental Association. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. You joining here shows your commitment to your business and the industry as a whole, so we thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are pleased today to have Scott Hazelton and Shane Norton with S&P Global Market Intelligence to present the Q1 market forecast. And at this point, take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody this next quarterly webinar. So I am Scott Hazelton. As you may hear from time to time, my voice goes in and out, so if it goes out permanently, Shane's here to take over, but hopefully we'll get through this time together without any incident. So, the usual format that we're going to go through is what's the sort of outlook for rental for Canada. We'll have sort of dessert first, if you will. Then we'll go through our view of the Canadian economy and what we think is driving that forecast. And then finally, there's a chance of some Q&A if you want to ask where things are going. It's a somewhat interesting time now. Less for Canada, for the U.S. The U.S. got some very real questions about what happens with things like inflation, interest rates. For Canada, we're a little more, I would say, positive on the outlook in terms of direction, although I think we're looking at a 2025 that is a bit of a mixed blessing, as we'll see in a minute. So as we always, we break this into three pieces: construction, industrial equipment, which is basically machinery with a purchase price of over $10,000. That is a little bit flexible. It was $10,000 back when we began to study back in 2000 and probably what, 6 or so. So it's probably worth more than that now, but you get the idea. Basically, if it's on wheels or treads, or otherwise large, it's CNIE. If it's general tool, typically things like jackhammers, tile saws, things which are not motorized, with engines, but have motors to power them. Those are general tool. And if I attend an event is what it sounds like tents, but also all the accoutrements that goes with that, like chairs and tables, but also more high value items such as sound systems, HVAC units. Those dance floors, those are also in there. But we think of it as being tents and chairs, but it's of course much bigger than that. So we'll go through these items that affect the forecast in a bit. It's really for your benefit up front to say what do we look at every quarter as we think about the forecast. So straight to the top, which is the total outlook of rental. We revised upward this year's estimate. Part of this is Q4 came in stronger than we thought at the end of last year. So that tends to change the year-over-year. It's called a base effect. So the year-over-year is increased in the first half of 2024. But also Q1 came in relatively strong too. So that impact has been revised upward, the outlook for this year, which no one's going to complain about. And with inflation stabilizing, that is a doubly good thing. We do think that growth will slow a little bit in 2026, down to about 2.2%. There's not a lot of, without a real recession in our past, there's not a lot of reserves to power a lot of expansion. And you see that in labor force, for example, where we simply can't get a lot more growth out of what we have in terms of labor, although we got some space on capital. But basically, we're up against the governor of what economies can do, and that sort of has an impact upon rental. The good news is, I would say that of the most recent data, investment spending has held up a little bit better than consumer spending. So we've got a generally positive view of growth in all three segments. And provincially, again, 2023 was the best year. It's behind us. It was, in some respects, a recovery year from uncertainties in 2021, 2022. It also had the benefit of, in many cases, some government subsidies that were pushed up post-COVID that were finally being used up at the end of last year, which gives you a bit of a drain coming into 2024 to start. even so, I think that 2025 is going to be, depends on what province you're in, but in general, it's looking to be a better year um, next year, but then it does tame the forecast quite a bit in the outer years. So for the next 2 years, though, we have got some cause for celebration. I would say that while Quebec and Atlantic provinces are lagging in this forecast, um, those growth rates aren't that bad. They're still more than keeping pace with inflation. So you've got net positive growth in volume as well as in nominal revenues. Look at the construction and industrial equipment category in isolation here. The green is the bars are obviously is the levels of spending. And you see there's no decline in this forecast. Growth rates get relatively low by 2026 down into the 2% range, but still a declining growth but expanding markets. And of course, inflation is falling down towards 2%. So by those outer years, even with that lower growth rate, you're still looking at a market that is at least level, perhaps even a tad stronger in terms of rental volume. Energy construction markets are what's giving us some growth at the moment. Res construction in Canada is declining. As in the US, it's actually growing a little bit, but it's relatively weak as history would indicate. But in Canada, they're coming off a boom. It's not like it's a bad market per se. It's it's not a bust from that boom. It's a slowing down from a boom that can't be sustained. So that does give us that lower growth trajectory, and that's not all a bad thing because the market really couldn't sustain a whole lot more heat. I don't think anyway. In fact, we'll see some of that in a minute with our view of home prices and affordability as weighing on that outlook a little bit. Provincially, again, there's no really bad news here. The growth leaders this year are your two biggest provinces, British Columbia and Ontario. Next year, it's Alberta and Manitoba, I believe. But again, it's pretty. Look at 2025. That's one of the most uniform pictures I've seen in quite some time for Canada. Everything is in that 6 to 8% range. We usually see more variation than that. So basically, a broad-based positive view for 2025 before slower growth in 2026. On the general tool side, this is a little more tied to, let's get it in a second, to manufacturing and to housing. I've already mentioned housing is under some pressure, and as we'll see with our backup slides, so is manufacturing. Certain segments are doing well, but in general, manufacturing as a whole is perilously close to recession. If you think about the PMIs that we look at, where 50 is expansion or 50 is level, and above 50 is expansion, below 50 contraction, we are operating right on the edge of that 50. So manufacturing is not a very strong growth driver here, nor is housing. So their growth rate is okay, 4.2%, not quite as strong as CIE. It does offer further growth. And again, inflation reduction will make these growth rates healthier. But by 2026, I would say that given that nominal growth of around 2% and inflation around 2%, you're looking at a flat, perhaps even declining modestly picture in volume for general tool revenue, but it's a little early yet. And so far, data's been coming in on the positive side, not the negative side. So if I had a reason to place bets, I'd say, we might get better, not worse. Looking forward, but right now it's you're looking at pretty close to zero growth in 2026 and beyond. Provincially, again, a relatively similar picture over history. Now, Quebec had a tough 2023, but again, looking at the beyond years, pretty good growth. I would say that in a market where we have a delayed recovery globally, commodity prices have been slow to to react. They spiked post-COVID. They've come down in many cases a fair bit, and then kind of hung out at a level point. If they do pick up, and Saskatchewan's one where they have some rather in fact one of their the prime minerals is used in treating PFAS, which with the U.S. we've got some very, very, very strict standards coming out to handle PFAS in the coming next year or two. It requires start putting these into effect, and that could be some good news for Saskatchewan in terms of demand for its minerals. But again, the slowing down in the longer run. Hinton event is driven by two things. One is major corporate events, which range from football games and hockey games, college games, to in extreme case Olympic Games, which you don't have in Canada this year. That's France's year. And also the more mundane things like graduations and retirement parties, which happen anyway. But if you've got a better outcome for personal incomes, you get to be a bigger event and heavier rentals. So this really is a function of what's happening with personal income at the sort of household level, and what's happening with corporate profits and investment at the corporate level. So we do have a fairly optimistic growth rate here, 4.7% this year, but even in the long run, 4 to 6% growth. I would say that all three segments have got some sort of secular trend underneath them, pushing up growth. Within construction industrial, that is to some degree specialty items that are now in demand that didn't used to be. Things like load centers, load banks, pumps, personal safety and hygiene equipment. That's been empowering a secular trend over and above the typical adoption of the equipment. And in Hinton event, we also see that kind of growth as is because more common to rent these things, particularly for caterers, than it is to own them. And personal use of cash for leisure activities is also an increasing share of disposable income. Hence, you get a better growth rate in Hinton event than the other segments on average, and that is certainly true in the forecast. Provincially, we don't usually see as much variation here because it is personal income based, and because, broadly speaking, Canada behaves quite similarly in terms of personal income because of the government safety net and so forth. You get booms and busts by provinces, but not to the same degree that you see in, say, construction spending, for example. So a broad-based, strong view with even some accelerations in 2026 and beyond. And so the provinces for a Hinton event in contrast to the more equipment-intensive categories. So what drives this forecast? Well, in broad terms for Canada, GDP growth at below potential is what we see in the coming years. Now, that's not all bad. I mean, last year, 2023, was not a very good GDP year. 1.1% growth is well below the trend of around 2. You can still have a good rental market if you've got the right characteristics under that, such as construction spending, and in that case, particularly housing. And looking forward, you see again that sort of a more positive view for rental than we do for the economy in 2024. That begins to fade a little bit in the outer years. I mentioned household consumption is weak. That is certainly true for retail sales. That's partly a function of housing cost, and that is why we're seeing Hinton event growing at 4 and 6%, not more like 8 and 10%, which we have seen in the past. Prior to 2020, we did see that kind of growth rate. Now, renovation spending, I'm not quite as sold on it being down as this suggests. And why is that? Well, certainly I think it'll be weaker. It's weaker because of affordability of housing, but renovation is kind of like rental. when do you rent? Well, if the market's really hot and you can't buy it, you rent it. And if the market's kind of uncertain, you don't want to take on all the risk of buying new equipment, so you rent it. Well, same thing with home improvement. If your market's hot and you're buying houses, existing homes, the first thing you do is renovate the kitchen or the bathroom. If you can't move because of transaction costs, you have to fix where you live, which means you also renovate. What does change is what you renovate. So if you're looking at rapid transactions in existing home sales, that's when you do see the spending on bathrooms and kitchens typically. If you're looking at staying in place for longer, that's when you do the maintenance things like roofing, siding, doors, and windows. So both of those are pretty intensive for pro um, carpenters. Both do involve a fair degree of rental, but instead of renting things for plumbing, electrical, maybe renting things for roofing and siding. So bear that in mind with that renovation forecast. Inflation has been a function of labor market conditions. In fact, tight markets have been pushing up wages. So even as we've seen declines in many commodities, we've seen wages remain stubbornly high. That's true throughout North America, and frankly throughout Europe as well. But we are seeing the unemployment rate rising slowly. That is a required condition to get inflation to ease. So it's not always a good thing, but in this case, it actually is. Um, and of course, we have the question about interest rates, which in Canada, we still believe that there's likely to be rate cuts in July or sooner, perhaps even June. So let's keeping track. The U.S. we have been thinking June. We end up pushing that back to July or later, if at all. Which what that means is quite possibly an improvement in the Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. dollar if that interest rate paradigm does evolve as sorry, if the U.S. dollar were to, so if the U.S. maintained rates higher than Canada's, the U.S. dollar will appreciate relative to the Canadian dollar. So bad news if you're importing, good news if you're exporting. So to think about that is a possible inflection point in the forecasting as we determine which way the U.S. goes with rate cuts that may affect exchange rates, which also depend upon oil prices, which we also don't see going any place up or down, really, frankly, that much in the near term. The neutral rate here, if you're into economic jargon, is a thing called the NAIRU. It's not a jacket; it is NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. Also called that on the GDP side, it's called the neutral rate for growth. So we're now saying that interest rates of about 2.5% are neutral. Economic growth up from about 2.25, which means that you're well within that target inflation rate. The neutral rate of inflation is now 2.5%, not 2.25%. And to the degree that the Bank of Canada has got their midpoint range at 2.5%, that would again sort of reinforce the notion of rate cuts in the second half of the year. This is a quick snap of the outlook. So we kind of covered GDP in the upper right quadrant, so upper left quadrant. Upper right is inflation easing, but slowly. And again, that dichotomy of wages versus goods or services versus goods, higher inflation still in services categories. And the lower left is that exchange rate picture, which again assumes that the U.S. And Canada are roughly in step with rates increases or decreases this year. But should that change, that slope gets a little bit more pro U.S. dollar and therefore pro exports on the Canadian dollar. And then on the right hand side is the current account balance, which is your trade flows. And looking at the forecast, it's pretty much a flat bag with neither imports nor exports causing any real change in the GDP outlook. And speaking of GDP, on the left-hand side, we have the forecast growth rates in the light blue or light green, teal, history and the forecast. So the obvious thing is um, is the reaction to COVID with the extreme downward upward cycle of 21 and 2020 and 2021. 22 also um, pretty strong growth. Now, ironically, 2023, that rather tame first light teal bar is 2023, because technically it's not an officially closed year until we get the final revisions from Science Canada. That will be that'll be this month, so you'll see that number become locked in next month, next quarter when we talk. So the real first forecast bar is that second teal green, which is an improvement over 2023. But as you look forward, relatively tame growth in the 2% range for next several years. On the right hand side, we're comparing Canada to some of the major trading partners, the U.S. being the biggest, and we see a bit of a shift there. That in the coming 2025, the U.S. will probably downshift, even as Canada has a modest upshift. The UK will have a strong recovery from a pretty almost recessionary economy, but growth rates well below what we'll be seeing in North America. And then Japan under quite a bit of pressure right now. In fact, the yen's been very much struggling, and again recover next year, but again by UK standards of growth, 1.2, 1.3%, not as strong as US and Canada. Though even here we're talking about 2%. We're not talking about a gangbusters forecast, just better for Canada than it is for the US. What's been driving construction growth? Well, on the right-hand side, this is sort of the allocation of where construction goes. Of course, half of it goes into housing in some sort, either single-family, multifamily construction, new building, or through renovation. The other half is everything else, with office being the biggest piece, followed by energy. However, the real growth market for the past 5 years has been coming out of the infrastructure category, partly a function of government stimulus spending post-COVID. That was a pretty commonplace for governments to spend some money to get the economy boosted. As that fades away, you see that drop in the 28 to 33 range, and it gets picked up somewhat by structures, in particular in that time frame. That is non-res structures, offices, factories, and so forth. But all in all, we're looking at growth that's in total construction spend, around 2% or so in the or under in the coming years. Not a lot of growth, but certainly this is real spending. It's not nominal, so it is definitely growth. There's no contractions here. Increases in volume of 1.5 to 2%, increases in nominal spend of probably twice that easily. And rentals tied to the nominal more than it is to the real. So generally speaking, it's good news there. Now, I mentioned before the manufacturing issue, and here you see it on both in an aggregate level. On the left hand side, the total manufacturing PMI, Purchasing Managers Index. That's actually quite nice. You can see the 50 mark, and we're literally right smack on it for the past couple of months. That's good news in the sense that we were below it for the past year, but as a signal of what's happening for the next 6 to 9 months, it's a signal of pretty much steady as she goes without a lot of upticks. On the right hand side, we see the components, and I apologize that we seem to have done a 45, 55 without a 50, which makes it a little bit harder to read this thing. But I would say that the challenge here is that the input prices are obviously increasing faster than 50. So the question is, are conditions stronger than they were last quarter at this time? So Prices being higher is not a good thing. That is a challenge. They are down from where they were. That's sort of good news, but they remain stubbornly high. In fact, they've actually ticked up over the past 3 quarters compared to where they were a year ago. Whereas other components are very close to 50 or a tad below, and the concern, of course, mostly is the new orders, because that tells you what to expect in the pipeline. That's the one that is basically right at 50, if we could actually see the 50 line. So again, sort of confirming that view of basically no change the next 6 to 9 months. Household income has become a little more modest. We'll see this in a while as to why. This is real income growth, not nominal. And so the um, the green is the private consumption growth. The yellow is disposable. So what's the difference, of course, is what you must spend your money on. So you take out taxes, you take out housing, and you get to the um, and food, you get to disposable income growth. So inflation being highest in those categories is what's causing the disruption. We'll see that quite vividly on the next slide. Um, Going forward, we do see a much more um, uniform alignment between real and nominal, but in 2024, we have this dichotomy where inflation is eating up a lot more of, um, even if it's real income, it's still eating up the disposable piece of that, or required piece of that, leaving a small disposable piece of that to go. And that is certainly a leaning on discretionary spending, and to some degree that would affect rental of tint and event. However, people also react to expectations. So you will spend money now if you think things get better next year. And so if you look at the forecast, it does get better next year. So we are taking a terribly hard knock at rental spending, because we don't think it's a long-term decline here. It's a short-term issue. Um, and while inflation is not transitory, um, it is also quite clearly subsiding. And here we take a look at those inflation rates. So the left-hand side is um, the core CPI that I think you follow and see the news every month, trending in the right direction, just a little more slow than we would like. On the right-hand side, you see the various flavors of that. And what I wanted to point out was that the teal, the darker green one, which is um, the common, but that's what includes housing costs in it. And so we have and food, and inflation is largely I would say largely confined, but predominantly these days confined to housing, food, and some degree fuel, which are all three, of course, in that required income and weighing on disposable income. And you see that they're relatively high and they're relatively slow to retreat. Um, and that hence the view that as long as home prices stay high, because the housing component of the CPI is two things. One is rent, which we know is increasing. And secondly, it's the imputed rent of owning your own home. So higher home prices lead to higher imputed rents. Now, home prices have been retreating in Canada. That is, um, somewhat good news, but retreating by, on average, 1 to 3%, depending upon the province you're in. So, on the whole, they're not giving a lot of, that is a downward trajectory, but it's not a significant enough decline to really ameliorate that inflation problem. Um, this is an interest rate profile I mentioned. I think the risk here is, will the U.S. Maintain that profile a little bit longer or not? We'll see. There actually is a small bet that rates would increase. That's about a 20% chance, I think, is being priced into the markets right now. But by and large, we do expect mostly synchronization between the U.S. and Canada, and we'll see how that plays out. We try to read tea leaves from Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve. We do that with some degree of success, but it's always a function of what happens to inflation next month. So there's always volatility in that outlook. And so far, it's been on the side of pushing out rate declines and stabilizing at the current, and I would say high rates, but any of us who are over the age of 40 or 45 remember buying houses with mortgages higher than they are now. So they're high by recent history standards. They're not actually high by historical standards in the overall scheme of investment spending. The exchange rate I kind of covered a little bit, is a function of the U.S. dollar, and the price of oil. The orange line on the right-hand side is the price of oil. This case, West Texas Intermediate, but it wouldn't matter if we're looking at Brent, the same general story. Prices basically moving sideways, we think, for the next several months. There's certainly some risk premium in that data, but not a lot. We've seen pretty well containment of issues in the Middle East and Europe in terms of conflict. And the longer term, we don't see a strong recovery in China or Europe for that matter. So absent a strong global recovery or a spike in conflicts that create a reduced supply, prices probably even decline a little bit in the coming year or two. Good news for overall costs, bad news for oil producing provinces. This is the home price slide I mentioned earlier. So on the left-hand side, you see an upward trend really over the forecast after minor correction. And that correction is really in context that, yes, prices decline. If you look at that trend, there's no question that it's a long-term upward trajectory with just a intermediate drop. On the right-hand side, you see it by province in terms of where the price declines occurred and when. But the key is that they're pretty much all ended, and the movement is once again on average upward. That's not true universally, but even where the provinces where it's still declining, that degree of decline has begun to moderate. So hence the view that home prices are going to be a headwind to construction going forward in terms of affordability. Good news in terms of profitability to home builders. Housing demand is obviously a key component to this outlook of General Tool, particular. 1 second. Left-hand side, you see a variety of new home price measures superimposed on starts. And the good news is that since 2022, home prices have come down. Home prices have come down in terms of rate of increase quite a lot. They still remain a challenge in terms of levels. And then you see the right-hand side with the view of housing starts. And as I mentioned, we're looking at a slowdown in housing starts. However, this is coming off 3 of the highest years in history for Canadian home building. So it's a matter of degree. Growth rates will slow down. Demand for rental of new equipment will slow down. If your fleet was built for the market in 2021, it may be too big in 2025. But if your fleet was built in the market in 2020, 13, 14, 15, that'd be perfectly fine in 2025. So it's all a matter of what your what your lot looks like in terms of mix of equipment, whether this is bad news or not. But it's certainly, think about the impact on home prices. Getting this decline in starts is good news to get that rate of increase down and get affordability back under control. Certainly, rate declines would help speed that process up, but we don't see that happening in certainly the next several months. Now I mentioned res investment. This is the total picture. This is spending on new and on improvement. We've got a pause right now. It does pick up. Now remember, starts can be going down, but if prices are going up, you still get an increase in the value of investment spending. So what this says is if that forecast with the starts turning down, remember, we don't have prices turning down. So the net result is a slow but steady increase in in investment. I would say that probably 40% of this spending is home improvement spending. Is a huge and I think somewhat underappreciated um, part of the market, and that tends to be much more stable than the overall construction activity. So again, if you're looking at home building slowing down, there may still be opportunities, renting to the home improvement market, which while also slowing down is not going to decline. It will just um, grow at slower rates. In some provinces it may decline, but on balance, it will change its mix, as I mentioned earlier, not drop entirely. Um, non-res construction spending. So total investment spending is structures, um, the blue line, plus machinery and equipment, the orange line, plus other things like software, but that's not really driving any of your business. We left it out here. Of those two big components, machinery and equipment versus structures, clearly the trend is towards structures. This is a reversal. Immediately post-COVID, we were investing in lots of equipment, trying to get more productive, offset those labor challenges. That's really plateaued. Um, you see that sort of increase from about 50 to 100 billion, 90 billion over the past 3 or 4 years. That's not pretty well stabilized over the forecast with low single-digit growth. It is structures themselves that have got the best outlook. Some of this is a function of the economic transition. If you renovate buildings, that counts as non-res construction, and certainly retrofitting offices and so forth for the post-COVID world with reduced workflows is a factor, but so is electrification. Um, and so the biggest growth drivers in this segment are not office buildings or even schools. It's data centers, to some degree warehousing, um, but anything involving utilities is another good one. So if it involves energy efficiency, energy transition, um, you know, efficiency in terms of data communications, AI, those kinds of structures have got the strongest growth potential, and they're typically very large structures. So when you get one, you get a huge growth of spending. When you don't get one, you don't get the same degree of boom. If you get a chip plant, you've landed um, in heaven. But looking at Canada, we're seeing increasing investment in BEV plants of battery electric vehicles, both the plants and then typically nearby is the plant to build the batteries that go into them. So that's where we're seeing most of this growth in the structural component. We're getting towards the end here. Emission trade is not really a big factor in this forecast. The import growth is probably a tad stronger, given that we have a rather positive view of Canada's economy compared to rest of the world. But it's key is a bit stronger. I wouldn't say it's a huge factor. The current account deficit is a function of prices of commodities as well as volume. So if you can export higher value items, so if oil prices go up, for example, if grain prices go up, which is what we expect in the forecast, um, those will, or mineral prices, as I mentioned earlier for Saskatchewan, those will increase the value of exports and hence improve um, the current account balance. You do see that in the near term that we have reversal of the balance for 3 or 4 years, courtesy of um, the value of exports, and then that will shift again to more long-term traditional declines in the balance over 2026 and beyond. But near term is a modest positive there. And I think it's maybe the last slide, but I mentioned oil prices as being a determinant of the value of the dollar. That's look at this recent history. It's not a lot of cause for joy or concern. Longer term, we do have that price declining a little bit, but the key is a little bit compared to historical norms. We're looking at a dramatic downturn. If you look back into the teens, we're staying well above those levels. So no real danger to Alberta, the Maritimes, or other energy producing regions, oil producing regions. And then finally, I was just, once again mention the inflation rate. This affects not just and of course the unemployment rate. Um, this affects not only the inflation. We're discussing a lot of that in terms of labor tightness impacting inflation. It also affects the upside of the economy to the degree that you uh, aren't growing population. We usually look at an optimum test of what could go right, what could go wrong. Um, and right now, those are pretty well in balance, but in terms of probabilities, but the gain to the upside is relatively weak because simply it's not the capacity to fulfill that demand should it occur. All it will do is rate that inflation and pull growth back down again. So, fixing the job creation engine through training, retraining, um, in some cases, immigration, that is sort of key to not only reducing inflation, but promoting long-term growth. And with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. I've need to change my view here to see if we've got anything out there. You say anything,
Yeah,
Sheldon, for questions?
yeah, absolutely. We'll take questions. If you have a question online, please take a moment to write it into the chat and send it to the host and panelists, and Scott will be able to answer that. I want to begin first by thanking you, Scott. I know you're not feeling well today, so I appreciate you getting in here and still delivering your presentation today. So that's greatly appreciated. It's always hard to talk about something like this without digging into politics and stuff like that. But we'll stay away from that discussion and we'll leave the floor open for questions. I know we've got a couple of great attendees on here that attend these all the time that should have some questions coming in.
Yeah, we discuss policy, not politics. So yeah, I
Well,
mean
it's
the
hard. I'm from
answer.
Alberta. We're an energy providing source and heavy into the politics out here, but we definitely don't want to dig into that today.
Hey, I'm from the U.S. We've got our own share of politics, so yours are mild compared to ours. So, um,
Yeah, we love the American politics. It makes ours like it doesn't even matter some days. So
but
it's
if you
fun.
do get questions that if the questions occur to you between now and whenever, feel free to drop me an email, drop Sheldon or Natalie an email, and we'll get back in contact with you.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great things for you folks to remember is that all of these presentations are now going to be available for future viewing. We are going to host them on our private YouTube channel. So you will receive an update once this quarter presentation is done. Everybody will get a link to that so that that can be shared. And Scott always makes himself available to answer any deeper in-depth questions for us as well. So I don't see any coming in quite yet, which surprises me because we've got a great group of people online. So with that being said, if there are no further questions, I definitely want to thank you, Scott, for being here today. And Shane, even though he didn't do anything, he was there for support. And I appreciate you working through your cold and getting it here today.
No, thanks. It's a pleasure. I wanted to do this, and fortunately, modern pharmaceuticals made that happen.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for your time. We appreciate you joining the Canadian Rental Association today for this presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at the Q2 presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks.